slides introduction to what are Microsoft Teams live events, right? Then we will take a quick look at how to schedule. I have a few screenshots again because of this technique. I couldn't show you the demo, but I'll walk you through how to schedule, what would be experience like, and based on my past experiences and some of the reading that I've done in the past, what are the things that you should be mindful of when running live events? Live events are not typical Microsoft Teams meetings, right? Like that you will run and collaborate with your colleagues or project team or what have you. Microsoft Live Events, it's a little bit different, and there are a whole bunch of recommendations that I think would be useful considering well before running the live event. So we'll go through those. And finally, just the Q&A to if there are any questions. So what are live events? So if you have a scenario, so as you already know that we have Microsoft Teams meetings, group discussion, but Microsoft Live Events is broad. Like if you have one to many scenarios where you would be broadcasting a message to larger audience, and you as an organizer or presenter would be just conveying some message. So you're leading the interaction and the users would be listening. Now, one of the biggest difference that you will see and hear in live events, the participants cannot talk. They can just simply ask questions using Q&A, and that's an option to enable it. I would highly recommend that you should be leaving that option enabled, but it's just one way audio, video, and content that a presenter is sharing. So what are some of the scenarios couple of scenarios that I'll walk you through? One of them is all hands meetings, right? Because we are all working in this hybrid scenario where we might have people joining from a different locations. They're working from home, or even if you have company or has a different branches across different cities or countries, you wanted to run an all hands meeting. A CEO every month runs a meeting, and they can leverage something like live events to broadcast to all their employees to some of the updates for the company, and employees all over the world can participate. So that's just one example. The second example would be something like webcast. You're a marketing company, you have a new product that you wanted to launch, and as a marketing lead, you wanted to run a live event and talk about your product, and all the attendees would be getting all the details about the new product that you would be getting. So these are some of the examples of live events. The primary thing that you need to consider is the amount of people that would be attending these events. Yes, so if you have events where you would be having more than 10,000 or around 10,000, so current limit, we will go through that as well. Initially, it started with 10,000. The current limit is increased to 20,000. And it eventually would probably change at some time in June this year. Because of COVID, Microsoft increased that limit to 20,000. But larger number of audience, you may want to consider something like a live events, and you have formal audio and video presentation that you wanted to do. Now, what are the differences between when you run Microsoft Teams meetings and the live events? So scenarios like one-to-one call or group calls or meetings, it's a quick call, right? So you could have a quick ad hoc call or a meeting, or you could have a scheduled meeting formally with your colleagues, team members, as opposed to live events. It's a formally produced event where you would have one or more speakers would be speaking and presenting their content to all the attendees. So that's more like a formal structure. And as I said, it's just one-way communication where audio, video, and content, depending on what you would like to share, would be shared with your attendees. Attendees can interact using Q&A as long as you have that option enabled. There are some of the limits that I mentioned, that what you cannot do. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but As I said, for one thing to remember is how participants would interact in live events, and that's Q&A, moderated Q&A that participants would be able to ask those questions, and there would be a moderator, most likely producer as a role. We will take a look at that. Would be able to then repeat those questions, and then presenters would be able to answer. So 4 roles that you need to be mindful of. Typically, ideally, there are 3, but officially you could call it 4 roles. Organizer is someone who schedules the live events. When you're scheduling a live event, there's no such thing as an organizer role. There are only 3 roles: producer, presenter, and attendees. Someone organizing or person organizing a live event automatically granted the producer role. And we'll talk about those roles as we go. But if there could be an option in your scenario that a person organizing might be a producer, but might not be active producer. They would just be assigned a role. Their role is to just schedule a live event and share the meeting invite with all the attendees. Now, in the meeting itself, there are 3 roles: producer, presenter, and attendees. So attendees, it's very simple, all the attendees who would be attending the meeting; presenter, who would be presenting audio, video, and sharing the content, right? So, and answering questions through moderated Q&A. Producer is a new role. That's probably, if you're new to live events, you might not know about this. The producer is the sort of host of the meeting that makes sure which content, which video goes on the screen when the live events started, when the live events ended. All those activities or actions being taken by producers. So producers are responsible for a great viewing experience for participants, because they control the sources for audio, video, not the audio, the video and the content. Sorry about the audio. Audio is always live. So these are some of these roles. You need to be careful and remember that a producer is a key role on top of presenters, because there could be 1 or more presenters as well. Now, creating a live event. So creating a live event, you will go to Microsoft Teams client on your desktop, and then click on New Meeting. Under New Meeting, there would be 2 options: New Meeting or a live event. Live events would give you an option to either pick and choose certain people or group, or it's an org-wide live event. If it's an org-wide live event, you would just simply need to, as an employee, need to sign in, but everyone in your organization can attend. So that likely be the default option for the type of use that you might have, but you might also have a division having a live event, and in that case, you will probably pick people and group option, be able to specify who would be attending, who can attend this live event. Now, in the screenshot, it's not been displayed, but there's a whole bunch of checkboxes at the bottom that where say live event production type. There's a recording option, but one of the options that is by default off is Q&A. So Q&A by default is turned off. I would highly recommend that whenever you're creating a live event, you scroll down and then make sure that Q&A is enabled. Once you enable the Q&A, you will have a toggle during the meeting to on and off the Q&A if you would like. So I'll certainly use that over no Q&A at all, unless this is just like, okay, I'm not going to allow any question. We'll just talk about the product or what have you. But Q&A, I'll keep it always as a back pocket option. So make sure that that checkbox is checked. So that's just the scheduling. Now, once you schedule it, you will send that invite to, so there's 2 URLs, one for the, and then when you're scheduling, you're adding 1 or more presenter, and then you're assigning them a role. And as you're assigning them a role, they will get the invite. When they join the meeting, they automatically get the presenter role. So this screenshot that you're seeing currently, this is me as a producer role. So producer sees this. that's a screen that producer would see. As you can see, there's two at the top. Very top, there is a number that shows how many attendees right beside the around live. At the bottom here, in the middle of the screen, there's two windows, queue and the live event. Now, this is something very interesting that you should remember. At the bottom here, all the presenters would have their video turned on, and there would one or more presenters would be sharing their content. As a producer, I pick the window and select which video would be going next live. So anything under queue is not live. It's not what all the attendees are seeing. Anything under live event, people would start seeing once producer clicks send live button at the bottom. So if at this point, if I would click send live, the slide deck would be replaced in the live event, and all the attendees would be seeing. So this is a screen that producer would manage. Producer would see this, and they decide. And as you can see at the bottom of the queue window, there's an option to have a split window where you could have a content and the video on both, or just the content. And you could pick and choose. And options here, send live, depending on what you chose in the queue window, will display either the entire screen video or content, or split. Then that's something on producer to decide. Now, as a producer, I could mute all the presenters. And that's an important thing to know, that you should be able to leverage that, because audio is always live. It doesn't really matter who's presenting in the video here. So say a person is on the video talking, but Amanda or someone else, like if I'm a presenter, if I start talking in the middle of the presentation, that audio is live, and there's no way you could just suppress that. So attendees would see or hear, actually, someone talking in the middle of the presentation. So that's something you should be mindful of, that when working as a producer, if there are other presenters speaking in the middle, you should always, and you will see in some of the recommendation, you should always ask everyone to mute their mic. Only the presenter speaking should be having their mic turned on. So this is for new producer. This is something will initially take some practice for how to use this. So I'll certainly recommend trying this out, dry running it multiple times before actually running the live event. This is what the presenters would see. So as a presenter, I would see this screen. I won't see the queue and the live. They will just see what's the status of this current screen. And then they will also see Q&A. If there are any Q&A, they will see that too. Producer also, actually, I should go previous. Producers also see Q&A from the top here. So it's not enabled right now. So if you click this option here, the Q&A window appears. The chat option here is between the producers and presenter. That chat is not been visible by the attendees. That's only strictly between producers and presenters. You could on the fly invite a presenter if you would like. So as a producer, you could invite one or more presenters on the fly if you need it. So this is something to keep in mind. As I say, this is what the presenters would see, and this is what an attendees would see. So once the event is live, attendees would see whatever's being presented as a live. They will see it. They will be able to ask questions here, and then they will see all the answers if someone's replying from the present, or they could hear the live answer given by the presenters or producers in the live event itself. You could, if you ask questions, you would have option to see either all questions or my question. There's a filter here, or actually sort here. You can sort by new, or you could sort by the number of likes. I like to sort it by number of likes if I'm a producer, because then you would be able to just ask questions or tackle them depending on how many likes the specific question got, right? Like say if a certain question get 100 likes versus all the others like around 10, I like to sort it by the number of likes. Now, one thing to remember, last I checked, it sorts descending. So you would have to go all the way down for the most liked question. So that's something to keep in mind. But this is what the attendees would see when the event is live. At the bottom, you would be able to pause and start, because it's streaming. It's not like live meeting, it's streaming. So you could pause and start again if you did. So here, once the meeting is over, you will have option to download the recording. I would highly recommend, so there's an option to share recording with all the attendees after the meeting. I'll typically uncheck that because I do want to download the recording first, because this is a formal event. There could likely be town hall or what have you. I would like to just make sure that the video, there's things that you wanted to edit in the video, you could, right? So I would uncheck that. I would use the recording download and then edit the video and then post it somewhere on the intranet or any other options that you might be using. Q&A report and attendee engagement report are also useful. So I would recommend that you wanted to see if there are any Q&A that you missed or you wanted to follow up after. Certainly useful for after the event, going and getting those Q&A. And then if you didn't cover any of those, you can answer them after the fact. So participants is engagement is how many attendees joined, when they left, those kind of details that you will get under engagement report. Recommendations, I won't call it best practices. This is just recommendations. So live event desktop app for presenters and producer. Now, producer, even today, it's still it's still the desktop app. You must need the desktop app if you're a producer. You can't use any other option to host or produce a live event. So that's something you must remember. Now, one thing that has changed since that I created the slide deck is a presenter can join a live event using an iPad. So that is something allowed, but that's the only other option outside of the desktop app. I still probably recommend using a desktop app for the formal event, but if you have an executive that prefers iPad or iPad Pro, that is supported. So as a presenter, you could leverage that. Producer, you still need to use the desktop app. Attendees can join using any platform. So as an attendee, you could join mobile, web, desktop, what have you, right? So that works for attendees. The only correction on this slide is that the presenter can now join using that iPad. So that's a change since I've created this slide deck. So when you're defining or creating or hosting a live event, you should define your roles. And I would always recommend having at least 2 producers. And there's a key to it. Because if you have just one producer, and producer is just driving the event, if you don't have if you're a producer running into bad network or internet is down or whatever challenges that one producer is going through, your event would not be able to go live. And hence, it's always recommend that you should have a backup producer always available. You can't assign producer on the fly. That's the thing. So when you're scheduling a live event, make sure you at least have one backup producer, just in case your primary producer cannot run the event. And while you have a backup producer, you should also recommend, I don't know if I have a slide in this deck, but you should always recommend, I would recommend that you should decide who has the control. Both producers should not control the event at the same time because they don't see the changes on each other's screen. So I as a presenter and Michael on the I as a producer and Michael as a producer, we both don't see what changes we are making in the queue window or we don't see it. Those windows are not synced. So we are running on our own. So while I recommend you should have 2 producers, the second producer is purely for the backup. Just in case if something happens and your primary producer cannot be available, make sure the secondary producer is ready to, it's like pilot and co-pilot, both are not flying at the same time. The other one is just simply there helping the primary pilot. So make sure that you remember to have at least 2 producers. While adding presenters, you would have 1 or more presenters that you are you know ahead of time, and when if it's just 1, that's it's as simple as it gets. But if it's more than 1, remember who's going to be running the content and in what order each presenter would be speaking. Now, if you have turned on the Q&A, make sure everyone understands who answers the questions, depending on are we answering questions in the chat window, or someone would be taking questions, things like that. So decide that ahead of time and not on the fly at the time of the live event. So make sure this is all rehearsed, decided, agreed upon. Dry run and rehearsal. I can't stress this enough, because this is a formal event and it's involved. It's not as simple as just running a Microsoft Teams event, Teams meeting. As a producer, if you're new, you should try and make sure that you practice how to use tools. As a presenter, your window might look a little different than your standard Teams meeting. So remember to do the practice dry run multiple times and get comfortable. Now, on the day off, once you start the live event, you can't just stop and restart. So once you start it, you need to let it start. So there's no harm in starting, but not going live. You can start the live event, but you're not live, so attendees won't see anything. Again, we know why it's important. As a producer, make sure you're connected to a reliable network. It's a formal event. You want to give the best experience to the attendees. Now, publishing Q&A. So when someone asks a question, it doesn't go live right away. All attendees, so I as an attendee, if I ask a question, not everyone would see that question right away. As a producer, they will, as a presenter and producer, they will see the questions that are being asked. Then at that point, you can either reply privately, and then you don't want to publish it, or if you think that that's a good question, you could publish a question. At that point, all the attendees would see a question, and then they can either like on that question if they have a similar question or not. But that is something you should remember. Now, while asking a question, attendees would have option to either ask that question anonymously or just as themselves. So that's an option as well while asking a question. And you would know that it's important in the formal events. Sometimes you do want to ask a question anonymously because your CEO, you don't want to ask maybe a tough question to your CEO. So some of the things that you should remember as an attendee, as a presenter and producer. But it's important to keep publishing good questions that you do want to handle at the end of the event. So simply use that. As I said earlier, sort your questions based on the likes. I like that because given the time, I might or not be able to, or we might not be able to go through all the questions at once. So certainly use that sort option and scroll all the way to the down where you will see the most liked question. So it's not at the top, it's at the bottom, the most liked question. So remember to do that. As I said earlier, audio is always live. So when you're using live events, your audio would always be live. As a producer, you are deciding which video and which content is going live. That you can control through queue and sending live. But audio is always live, so whoever speaks anything, attendees would hear that. So that is something you should always remember. That's why it's important, and I can't stress enough that mic should be muted all the time. During a live event, your mic should be muted because the moment someone's presenting and you think you can speak and have a side conversation, all attendees would hear that all. So make sure you decide and agree upon muting them, keeping the mics muted until their turn. Start the meeting early. Again, based on my experience, it's very important for any formal event that start the meeting at least half an hour early or at least 20 minutes early for final equipment check, final checking on who's going to be speaking on which slide. If there are any questions, last minute changes happens. So make sure you start early. You don't go live early, you just start early. So that at least the presenters and producers can have a discussion in the meeting. At that point, you're just simply running a Microsoft Teams meeting between presenters and producers. Once producers send this live, that's when attendees would see it, and that's when the meeting starts. Now, one thing that I would highly recommend, any live event that you're running, as I said, attendees do not know what's happening on the other side. So when you're not ready to go live, at least have one slide that says event will start soon. Otherwise, they will see a blank screen, and that's not a good user experience on the other side. So always have a nice intro, event will start soon, or something along that line that tells attendees that hold tight, we will be starting this meeting in 15 minutes or whenever you think you're planning to start or around that time. So make sure that you use that option as opposed to just leaving attendees with the blank screen, because sometimes your meeting may get delayed by a couple of minutes and attendees would then start thinking what's happening. So if you're not ready to go live, make sure all the audio sources are muted, because as I said, if you say something, they would hear it. So that's also important to note. But make sure that there's a good slide ready before your meeting starts. Now, this is also an important one. Live events is a delayed, as I said, it streams. So it's delayed by a few seconds. So it's whenever you say, oh, do you have a question? And you don't get a question for 30 seconds, don't end it, because they might not even hear that question for at least 20, 30 seconds, depending on where they are. So give at least a couple of minutes before assuming that there are no more questions. So when the event is delayed, so by the time you say, do you have any question, they might still be on the last slide that you just presented. So do remember that could happen, and hence it's important to give enough time to all the attendees to ask if they have any questions. Again, based on my experience, you must use multiple monitors when you're a producer. And there's a reason for that. Because many times when you have one or more presenter, there's a common deck, right? Like common PowerPoint presentation. And who's going to be running? Because you don't want to be into, okay, I'm going to run my slides and then I will stop sharing and someone would start sharing. It's always recommended to just keep one slide deck. And when that happens, typically a producer is responsible for running a slide deck as well. If you have an additional person who can just share the content as a presenter, the rest would be speaking, that's fine. That's acceptable. In that case, 2 monitors might not be needed. But I think it would be, based on my experience, it would be very useful to have 2 monitors for the producers, because then it becomes much easier for them to manage multiple things if there's, as I said, scenarios where they are sharing content as well as managing the event. So, and that always happens when there's more than one presenter. If there's just one presenter, it doesn't make a huge difference, because then the same presenter can run the deck. But something to keep in mind, it would be useful to have a multiple monitor for the producers. Now, this is also an important one. When you create a live event, there's a URL that gets generated for the attendees. You can copy that URL from once your live event gets created. So once you copy that URL, typically what I've seen is most people would send that URL to the attendees. Now, I would recommend just using some sort of URL shortener. If you have an enterprise handy, like you're using something, you use that and send that URL that you use to shorten the actual URL. And the point here is, don't send the actual URL for multiple reasons. One, sometimes you may decide that while practicing or while doing the dry run, you may decide that, you know what, you don't want to use the live event, you want to use standard Microsoft Teams meeting because of X, or you want to use something else. Point is, you don't want to keep changing the URL of a formal event and keep sending them updates on the calendar. Just keep, because you could just simply give them one URL, and then in the backend you can always change the URL as needed. I've seen that happen, and that's why it's important that for any formal events, never send them the actual meeting URL. Just send them the URL that you shorten, and then if you ever needed to change the URL behind the scene, you could always do that. Q&A. So I think that's all. I didn't want to take too much of your time. I just wanted to go through some of the recommendation. If there are any questions posted, there's a few more things that I wanted to cover. So licensing, it's important to note that there is a specific requirement for creating a live event. For the licensing, producer presenters is the Microsoft Teams or Stream license. Attendees, they typically don't require any license. So remember that. As an admin, you should also remember that there are certain policies that you can control for the live events. One of them is, do you want to allow people to create live events from the admin center? And by default, it's turned on. As you can see that from the screenshot, allow scheduling is on. But if you, for whatever reason, do not want to turn that on, you can always go and then control that policy. And you can see, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but you can see that some of these settings, recording options or attendee visibility option, you can see there's an option you can always disable everyone in the organization is the default, and public is disabled. So you can always change these options, and you could allow anyone outside of your org to join as well, depending on the settings that you've chosen in the policy. So these are the policy in the Teams Admin Center that you can control. And then there's a tenant-wide configuration that's using the PowerShell only. If you're using the CDN this is typically if you're using external device for broadcasting, this would be useful. Other policies affecting live events are the presenters needs meeting policy that allow the screen sharing. So some of the meeting policies that still applies to the live events as well. And that is something you should consider while using the live events, because there are two. If I would go back on this screen here, there's the meeting policies on this screen. Under meetings, there's meeting policy in the live events policies. Now, couple of the meeting policies do apply to live events as well, and that is something you should consider while using the live events. So to summarize, as of today, I'm pretty confident that it's probably till June 2022. Live events would allow end users to run events up to 20,000 attendees. You could have 50 live events in parallel. These limits may change depending on how things unfold in future. And again, this slide needs a slight change. Producer needs the Microsoft Teams client. Presenter can now attend using Microsoft Teams client or an iPad. And then administrator can manage the live events through the events feature. So with that, I'm going to conclude it. There are a couple of things that you should know, that you please join Microsoft 365 Chicago, supporting Chicago Public School through the Children First Fund. And then there is a survey. So please provide the feedback, things that you liked, constructive feedback if there's any. Feel free to provide that. It will help me also improve the presentation as well. And there's a raffle and giveaway at the end, so make sure that you register for that too. With that, I'll just conclude it. I'll wait for, just like as I said, I'll wait for a few more minutes to see if there are any questions. If not, I would like to thanks everyone to attend the meeting. So there's one question there I can see. Is it truly anonymous, so it can never be traced back to the poster? That is absolutely correct. Yes, the questions asked during the live events is truly anonymous. There's no way. It's just not like Microsoft. I think it also works the same for forms as well. But yeah, there's no way for anyone to track who asked the question. And I can confidently say that's truly anonymous. Okay. If there's no more question, again, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session and have a good day. Thanks.